Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into one of the most elegant, yet surprisingly quirky traditions in British history, the Victorian tea party. Imagine yourself walking into a sunlit drawing room filled with the hum of hushed conversations and the soft clink of fine china. The air is thick with the scent of freshly brewed tea, its steam curling upwards, mingling with the sweet aromas of scones and pastries. Silk dresses swish as the ladies gather, their laughter echoing softly, while the gentlemen lounge in their starched suits, occasionally glancing over the tops of their teacups. There's a certain stillness in the air, but it's a stillness filled with unspoken rules, intricate rituals, and the weight of social expectation. But let's be real, you probably won't survive this if you are not accustomed to a world where even the way you hold your teacup can define your social status. You see, Victorian tea parties weren't just about enjoying a warm cup of tea. No, these were carefully orchestrated affairs, where every sip, every bite, and every word had a purpose. Everything was coded, from the teacup to the way you were seated, and there was an art to it all. The whole thing was a performance, and one wrong move could knock you from the highest echelon of society to a mere guest in the corner. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, post your location and the time of day where you're re-listening. I am curious where you're rejoining from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. As you settle into the world of Victorian high society, the first thing you should know is that the ritual of tea was no casual affair. This was just a case of throwing a bag in a mug and calling it a day. No, tea parties were carefully orchestrated events that took hours to prepare for, and each step in the tea process was imbued with social significance. The tea itself, loose leaf, of course, was placed in a delicate porcelain teapot, often with a cozy knitted cover to keep the heat in. The water had to be just the right temperature, not too hot, and definitely not lukewarm. Too hot, and you'd burn the leaves, ruining the whole pot. And let's face, tea enthusiasts were passionate about their tea. Once brewed, it was poured into delicate porcelain cups, which you're supposed to hold with 2 fingers, no cradling the cup like you're 5 years old. A fine-boned china teacup wasn't just a vessel, it was a symbol of social status. If you were invited to a high-class tea, you'd find yourself holding a dainty cup with your fingers poised just so, never gripping it too tightly, always aware of the grace you were expected to convey. And while we're at it, milk, sugar, and lemon, they were handled with just as much attention to detail. There was a specific way to add each, and heaven forbid you got it wrong. Milk had to go in after the tea, not before, lest you be marked as someone unrefined. Adding sugar or lemon to your tea was fine, as long as you did it with the appropriate level of discretion. Now here's where it gets interesting. Historians still argue whether the custom of afternoon tea was invented by Anna, the Duchess of Bedford, or if it was a broader tradition that simply found its time to shine during the Victorian era. Some say it was Anna's clever move to stave off hunger between lunch and dinner, while others point to the larger cultural shift toward afternoon leisure as the true origin. Either way, what is clear is that this tea ritual became so popular by the mid-1800s that it quickly spread across the upper classes, and soon after, it trickled down to the middle class, becoming a defining feature of Victorian society. But there's more to it than just tea and manners. As we continue, we'll see how tea parties served as a stage for society, where politics and gossip played out with the same level of formality as the tea itself. Imagine sipping your tea while discussing matters of national importance, or more likely exchanging stories and small talk that could decide your place in society. It wasn't just about the tea, it was about what was unsaid that truly mattered. As you sink deeper into the world of Victorian tea parties, it is important to understand just how deeply ingrained tea was in the social fabric of the time. These gatherings weren't merely about sipping tea in peace, they were about reinforcing the social hierarchy. You didn't just go to a tea party. You attended one based on your social standing. The location, the invitation, and even your position at the table were all carefully dictated by class. The higher up the social ladder you were, the closer you were to the host. The seating arrangements were often carefully planned, and there were unwritten rules about where each guest should sit. Not following these could cause awkwardness and, in some cases, ruin the entire gathering. Imagine entering the drawing room as a guest. The first thing you'd notice is how everything has its place. There are subtle cues everywhere. The fine china, the arrangement of treats on the table, the number of servants standing at attention, all of these were expressions of status. The most prominent guests were seated closest to the host, often facing a large mirror, so that their social superiority could be reflected back at them in every glance. The ones on the fringes, however, found themselves in lesser seats, perhaps even behind a decorative table, serving as witnesses to the high society drama unfolding before them. Of course, it wasn't just about where you sat, but also about the conversations that you were part of. If you were seated in the center, you were expected to engage in intellectual conversation. Tea parties were not just opportunities to gossip about the weather. They were forums for discussing everything from literature and politics to philosophy. This is where the idea of the art of conversation took shape. What could you say, and what couldn't you say? Historians still argue whether conversation at tea parties was more about presenting yourself as a cultured person or about building political alliances in an informal setting. Either way, one thing was certain. A good conversation could elevate you in the eyes of the host, while a poor one could leave you at the fringes of society. But don't get too comfortable, because at these affairs, a faux pas could cost you, and we're not just talking about spilling the tea. Let's face it, the Victorian social system was like a high-stakes game, and every move you made had consequences. You could insult your hostess by failing to observe the right etiquette, or worse, inadvertently break an unspoken social norm. You see, at tea parties, there were not just written rules, there were social expectations, so precise that even the smallest mistake was likely to be remembered for years. It was no surprise that the parlor game often played was one where guests attempted to guess each other's secret, proving that beneath all the polite behavior, Victorian society was still obsessed with social rank and image. As you relax and take in the next part of this story, it's important to realize that these tea parties weren't just a leisure activity. They were the lifeblood of Victorian high society, where alliances were made, reputations were solidified, and sometimes, the most critical decisions of the day were made over a cup of tea. So let's take a look at how the very setting of these parties, the fine china, and the intricate teapots contributed to the larger social game. As you settle into the charm and subtle intrigue of the Victorian tea party, let's pause for a moment and focus on the seemingly small details that played a massive role in these grand affairs of teacups and utensils. It may sound trivial, but the teacup was not just a vessel for tea. It was a symbol of status. In fact, the choice of teacup could say as much about you as your words, your dress, or even your place. At a table, the Victorians were obsessed with decorum and refinement, and no detail was too small to escape scrutiny. Most tea parties used bone china teacups, which were prized for their delicate nature and beautiful designs. But it wasn't just about the material, it was the aesthetic details that mattered. For the highest tier guests, teacups were often adorned with gold leaf, intricately painted florals, or even rare birds, making the cup itself a work of art. If you were served tea in a cup that was too plain or damaged, it might signify that your social status had been overlooked, that you were not worthy of the finer things in life. Imagine the subtle insult of sipping from a cracked, dull cup while others around you were cradling golden-edged perfection. Beyond the teacup itself, the utensils were also meticulously selected. A silver spoon, often engraved with intricate designs, was a must-have accessory for any proper tea service. You might think that a spoon is just a spoon, but in the Victorian era, even the smallest details carried meaning. These spoons weren't just used for stirring, they were used as part of the tea ceremony to show off your refinement. When you stirred your tea, the motion had to be gentle and slow, mimicking the calm and calculated rhythm of high society. Any hasty or improper movement could be interpreted as a sign of ill breeding. The proper way to use a spoon was not to stir vigorously, but to gently swirl the tea, allowing the sugar and milk to mingle as smoothly as the conversation around you. Historians still argue whether these minute details, the choice of teacup, the way you stirred your tea, were simply a reflection of social hierarchy, or whether they were part of a larger system of rituals meant to enforce social control. Some believe it was all about performance, showing your guests that you could follow the rules of refined society without breaking a sweat. Others contend that these rituals helped people maintain social order, subtly reminding everyone of their place at the table. Either way, the tea party was as much about visual display as it was about the actual tea. As we move deeper into the history of tea parties, remember that the real charm wasn't in the tea itself, it was in the rituals and gestures that turned something as simple as drinking tea into an elaborate performance. And while all this may sound like a lot of work, these parties weren't all about the formalities. No, there was a sense of play, too. The slightly tongue-in-cheek nature of the tea party was part of its appeal. After all, what is the point of following 1,000 rules if you can tea break a few for fun? Let us take a look now at how the conversation itself played a central role in these high society gatherings. Now, let us talk about the most crucial and perhaps the most delicate aspect of any Victorian tea party: conversation. You see, tea parties weren't just about drinking tea and nibbling on pastries. The real purpose was the art of conversation. In the world of Victorian high society, conversation was an incredibly precise art, one that could elevate you or destroy you depending on what you said and how you said it. First, let's talk about the topics. You weren't supposed to just talk about anything that popped into your head. No. Victorian tea parties were highly structured, and the conversation had to match the formality of the event. There were a few topics that were acceptable, and many more that were strictly off. Politics, absolutely forbidden. Too controversial. Religion, definitely not. Those were risky subjects that could disrupt the carefully curated atmosphere of polite society. The conversation had to stay light, pleasant, and above all Instead, guests might discuss the latest novel, the newest developments in fashion, or the ongoing season at the opera. But here's the thing, there was still room for intrigue. Even though the topics were tame, the way you navigated these subjects was everything. Historians still argue whether the ideal Victorian conversation was more about appearing cultured or actually being cultured. Some believe that these gatherings were simply an opportunity for people to show off their intellect, using their conversations to signal their status and reinforce their place in the social hierarchy. Others argue that the ability to talk shop about the finer things in life was just as important as having the right clothes or the right teacup. You had to be in the know, and those who weren't had little chance of ever truly integrating into high society. Of course, it wasn't all about showing off intellectual prowess. There was also a quirky side to these conversations. In fact, the Victorians had a peculiar fondness for the absurd in their discussions. For instance, one of the most popular topics at tea parties was the latest medical fads. Yes, people actually discussed treatments like bloodletting and the benefits of swallowing live frogs. This blend of high-minded topics with oddball conversation made tea parties simultaneously dignified and slightly absurd. Imagine sipping your tea and calmly discussing the medicinal qualities of drinking horse urine. That was a thing. And then there was the game of wit. For every polite tea party, there was at least one person who played the role of the wit, trying to make the conversation as sharp as possible. These people were the life of the party, the ones who would drop clever remarks or subtle jabs that kept everyone engaged. However, just like with the tea itself, they had to be careful not to go too far. Too much humor, too many jokes, or too much cutting wit could make you seem unsophisticated, even crude. Tea parties were a balancing act. Too little personality, and you'd fade into the background. Too much, and you'd end up an outsider. You may be wondering, did people actually enjoy these stifling conversations? The answer is more complicated than you'd think. While it may sound like a lot of work, the structure of these conversations made them a way to signal safety. Everyone knew the rules, and if you followed them, you were accepted into the fold. But it wasn't just about fitting in. These gatherings also served as a safe space for the upper classes to show off subtly, of course, and engage in polite gossip. After all, what's a tea party without a little tattle? As we explore further, we'll see how women, often the primary hosts and participants in these parties, found a way to influence the conversations, sometimes even controlling it without ever seeming to have too much power. It was all about influence in subtle ways. As we delve deeper into the Victorian tea party, let's shift our focus to the role of women. Tea parties were, of course, primarily social occasions for women, so much so that they were often the central figures around which these gatherings were evolved. But it's important to remember that these were not just leisure events. They were a reflection of power dynamics and the social order of the time. Women weren't just sipping tea, they were subtly exercising influence in ways that often went unnoticed by those around them. At first glance, it might seem that women at tea parties were simply adhering to a set of strict societal norms. But in reality, these tea parties were a kind of playground for social power. The hostess, who typically controlled the guest list and the seating arrangement, had significant influence over the flow of conversation and the tone of the event. In fact, historians argue that the tea party hostess was one of the most powerful figures in Victorian society, holding the ability to make or break relationships with a simple invitation. However, the most interesting aspect of this social maneuvering was how subtly women exercised their influence. At a time when women were largely excluded from formal political power, tea parties became an important forum for social influence. a woman's ability to host a successful tea party, and to carefully curate the guest list was a quiet but effective form of power. By controlling the flow of conversation and the people with whom they associated, women could establish important alliances and shape the social landscape of their time. That said, it wasn't just about who you invited. The conversations that occurred at these tea parties had a tangible impact on social order. A well-placed remark or a bit of gentle gossip could solidify a woman's position in high society or tear it down completely. Tea parties, in this way, were conduits for social maneuvering, allowing women to exert influence and create networks of power that often went unnoticed by the men who dominated the more public aspects of society. Yet, despite this, there was a sense of constraint that came with being a woman in Victorian society, particularly when it came to how women were expected to behave in these spaces. There was an almost paradoxical tension. While women wielded immense influence in these social settings, they were also expected to remain the picture of grace and decorum. They were encouraged to exert their power through subtlety, through carefully measured words, and actions never appearing as if they were trying too hard to be powerful. A woman who was too assertive, too bold in her opinions, could easily be seen as overstepping her bounds and lose her social standing. Historians still argue whether these carefully cultivated social gatherings were a form of empowerment, or merely another way for the Victorian social system to maintain control over women. On one hand, they provided women with an opportunity to shape the narrative of their social world, giving them a voice in a society where they were otherwise marginalized. On the other hand, these tea parties reinforced the boundaries that kept women within the confines of their traditional roles. No matter how much influence they may have had, it is a classic example of how Victorian society both empowered and constrained women at the same time. As we move further into the world of Victorian tea parties, LLC, how the conversation around the tea table wasn't the only thing being controlled. The fashion worn to these events also played an integral role in signaling status, and for women, it was just as important as the tea itself. But before we get into that, let's take a moment to consider how men fit into all of this. After all, tea parties weren't just for women. There was also a very specific role for men to play, though it wasn't always as central as you might think. Now that we've explored how women held subtle but significant power at tea parties, it is time to turn our attention to the men and the surprisingly specific role they played in these gatherings. While the Victorian tea party was largely a woman's domain, men didn't just sit on the sidelines. They had a part to play, but it was a more passive one compared to their female counterparts. Men in the Victorian era were often seen as the breadwinners and the ones in charge of the formal politics and business, so their involvement in the social sphere, particularly in tea parties, was somewhat limited. However, men at these tea parties were by no means forgotten or irrelevant. In fact, their presence carried significant social weight. They were typically seen as the backdrop to the conversation, providing an air of authority and dignity to the gathering. Men at these tea parties were expected to listen attentively, occasionally offer an opinion, and engage in small talk with the other guests. But their role was never as central as the women's, who were in charge of leading the conversation and maintaining the flow of social interactions. That said, tea parties still provided an opportunity for men to show off their own refinement, though in a more subtle way. Men were often scrutinized for their mannerisms and how they conducted themselves at these events. Tea parties were one of the few settings where men were expected to exhibit a level of restraint and politeness, qualities that were otherwise reserved for women. Their interactions with the female guests were a test of their social grace. They had to strike the perfect balance between appearing interested but not overbearing, charming but not flirtatious, and attentive but not too eager. Interestingly, the conversation topics in these gatherings were often different for men and women. While women would often discuss topics like literature, fashion, and family, men would tend to lean toward more serious topics like politics, current events, and the affairs of the day. It wasn't uncommon for the men to leave the women to their own discussions after a while, and to retire to another room for their own more focused discussions, often about business or national affairs. Yet despite their more passive role, the men's involvement in these gatherings was crucial in maintaining the social order. Their mere presence in the tea party was a reminder of the social structure and the importance of gendered spaces. The tea party acted as a social performance, one where everyone knew their place. The fact that men were largely passive at these events may seem odd to us today, but it was a reflection of the highly stratified nature of Victorian society, where each group had a specific role to play. In this section, we've explored the role of men at the tea party. But let's now turn to something equally important. The fashion. Yes, The clothes you wore to a tea party weren't just about keeping up with the latest trends. They were a direct reflection of your place in the social hierarchy. Fashion was an essential part of the tea party, and your attire could speak volumes about your wealth, your taste, and, ultimately, your social standing. Let's take a closer look at what it meant to dress for a Victorian tea party, and how fashion played a role in reinforcing class divisions and expectations. Now, let us turn our attention to perhaps one of the most visible aspects of the Victorian tea party. Fashion during the Victorian era was not just about looking good, it was about showing your status. In fact, clothing played a key role in signaling who you were, where you stood, and how well you fit into the complex social hierarchy of Victorian society. Tea parties were no exception. The attire worn to these events wasn't just about fitting in, it was about making a statement. For women, attending a tea party meant being dressed to the nines. There was no such thing as casual attire in the Victorian world. The dress code for women attending these gatherings was nothing short of elaborate. The gown had to be perfectly fitted and adorned with delicate lace, ribbons, or feathers materials that were indicative of wealth and sophistication. A woman's silk or velvet dress was often paired with gloves, bonnets, and sometimes even a lace shawl draped over her shoulders. Every piece had to be just right, and any deviation from the expected could risk social disgrace. Imagine trying to attend one of these events without the proper attire. Wouldn't he just be considered out of place? You'd be seen as a social outsider, someone who didn't understand the unspoken rules of high society. The most important thing to remember about Victorian fashion was that you were what you wore. Corsets were accentuating her curves in a way that society deemed appropriate. While modern-day corsets are often seen as restrictive, they were a symbol of refinement in the Victorian era. They were so important that, at tea parties, women could be judged by the quality and fit of their corsets, with the more elaborate and well-made ones being seen as indicators of wealth and status. For the gentlemen, the dress code was also formal, though it was somewhat less intricate. Tailcoats were common, along with starched shirts and cravats, a precursor to the modern necktie. Dark trousers, often of wool, and polished leather shoes completed the look. Just like their female counterparts, men's attire was meant to show that they were properly educated and aligned with the values of high society. The most important part of a gentleman's attire at a tea party, however, was his mannerisms. While women wore their clothes to attract attention and signify their place in the social order, men wore theirs to blend in, showing that they knew their role in the grand social structure without drawing too much attention to themselves. Historians still argue whether the extravagant focus on fashion in the Victorian era was a direct reflection of class anxiety, or if it was more about maintaining a visual social order. On one hand, it could be seen as a way to constantly remind society where people belonged. You a wealthy aristocrat, so you must wear silk and velvet. On the other hand, fashion was also an act of self-expression, albeit within a very tight set of rules. The Victorians were all about showing off their social refinement, without appearing too eager to do so. But there is another interesting layer to Victorian fashion that is often overlooked. Fashion as power. The wealthy elite didn't just wear expensive clothing, they also set the trends that dictated what was considered fashionable for the rest of society. And even within high society, there was a constant competition to have the most elegant and innovative outfits. This competitive edge even reached the tea parties, where guests would often compare outfits and discuss the latest trends with a quiet, competitive air. Wearing the right clothes could put you at the center of attention, but it could also grant you greater access to the higher echelons of society, where the real power was. In the world of Victorian tea parties, every detail was an opportunity to express status and control. And yet, while fashion played a crucial role in determining your place, conversation was still king. The way you spoke, the topics you brought up, and the tone of your voice were just as important as your teacup or your corset. But what did they talk about at these grand tea parties? What topics could you safely broach, and which ones were strictly off? Let's dive into the conversation etiquette of the Victorian tea party in the next section, where we'll explore how to navigate these social waters without upsetting the balance of power. Now that we've explored the role of fashion and its crucial part in the ritual of Victorian tea parties, let's move on to the heart of it all. In many ways, conversation was the most important element of a tea party, more than the tea itself. Imagine being in a room filled with some of the most powerful people in society, each one carefully navigating the conversation, trying not to step on any toes, yet constantly positioning themselves for social gain. The topics you chose to discuss, the tone of your voice, and the way you interjected all had a tremendous impact on how you were viewed and whether or not you were invited back. Victorian society was a finely tuned machine, and the rules of conversation were just as rigid as the rules of fashion and behavior. The most significant element to remember about conversation at a tea party is that it had to be polite, indirect, and full of subtlety. Anything too direct or controversial could quickly derail a perfectly orchestrated event. So, what could you talk about at these gatherings, and what was considered unacceptable? Well, for one, politics and religion were firmly off. Too much passion about either could make you look unrefined, or worse, dangerous. Conversations at tea parties were meant to stay light, gracious, and most importantly, the most common topics revolved around art, literature, and the latest social trends. For instance, guests often discussed the latest novels or shared reviews of the opera performances they had attended. Victorian society loved to discuss the arts, but only in a way that remained harmless and safe. Too much enthusiasm for a work of art could suggest that you were overly passionate, which was frowned upon. Enthusiasm, after all, was a show of unrefined emotion. And at a Victorian tea party, only subtlety and restraint were encouraged. And then there were the unspoken rules that governed these conversations. For one, you could never interrupt a guest, no matter how much you disagreed with them. Interrupting someone was the ultimate social faux pas, marking you as ill-bred, and instead, the correct way to engage in conversation was to listen intently, nod at the appropriate moments, and wait for an opening to gracefully interject your thoughts. But even then, your words had to be carefully chosen. Anything too bold, too forward, or too unrefined was a surefire way to become a social outcast. One wrong word could mean the end of your social career. Historians still argue whether these conversations at tea parties were merely a display of refined culture, or if they were a method of social control, a way of ensuring that no one ever got too outspoken or revolutionary. Some believe that the strict rules of Victorian conversation was simply a reflection of a society that was terrified of change. Others argue that these rituals helped people feel connected in a world that was rapidly evolving, providing a safe space for them to interact and reinforce the existing social structure. Either way, these tea parties were not just about drinking tea, they were about maintaining the social order. But what happens when you accidentally slip? Well, we've already established that too much emotion, or too bold a statement, could cause a social scandal. But there was one thing even more dangerous at a tea party than a bad opinion. Yes, Victorian tea parties were not complete without a bit of gossip. The art of subtle, restrained gossip was just as important as the tea itself. And interestingly, gossip wasn't always about spreading malicious rumors. It was more about sharing information in a way that kept you in the know. The goal wasn't to hurt others. It was to maintain your place in the social sphere. And let's be honest, who doesn't endure a bit of light gossip now and then? Especially if it helps you fit in. But of course, there were always boundaries. Gossip that crossed the line could easily ruin reputations. The key to good gossip at a tea party was being able to hint at something, but never outright say it. It was the art of saying just enough to make others curious, but never enough to actually cause a scandal. So, next time you sip your tea, just remember that while the water might be calm on the surface, there's always a lot more bubbling beneath. Let us take a look at how tea parties continued to evolve, and how they slowly became more accessible to the growing middle class in the next section. As we continue to peel back the layers of the Victorian tea party, we come to one of the most delightful aspects of these gatherings: the menu. It wasn't just about the tea, although that was, of course, the central feature. The real magic of these events lay in the food, a dazzling array of sweets and savories that would make any modern afternoon tea look like a humble snack. The tea table was a visual feast, as much about what was served as how it was presented. The Victorians, especially the upper classes, prided themselves on their culinary sophistication, and the menu at a tea party was one of the clearest signs of social standing. Scones, served warm with clotted cream and jam, were a staple of the afternoon tea table. There were also finger sandwiches, often filled with cucumber, egg, and cress, or smoked salmon. The sandwiches were delicate and cut into small, neat squares or triangles, no crusts allowed because, of course, crusts were considered unrefined. If you were lucky enough to be seated at the most prestigious position at the table, you would find yourself served the best cuts, and the more extravagant treats like tiny tartlets and marzipan cakes. Everything was about display, and the aim was always to impress your guests with the visual splendor of the food. One fascinating aspect of Victorian tea parties was their timing. Afternoon tea was a deliberate pause in the day, usually served between 3:30 and 5 p.m. a few hours before the evening meal. This was a time when the busy schedules of Victorian society could afford a break, allowing the upper classes to indulge in food and conversation before returning to the more serious business of the evening. It was essentially a luxurious interlude, a moment where high society could unwind while indulging in light foods that still conveyed elegance. Historians still debate whether the evolution of the afternoon tea as we know it today owes more to Queen Victoria, her own personal preferences, or to the changing economic dynamics of the time. Some believe that Queen Victoria, who had a deep affection for tea, helped solidify its place in the cultural fabric of England by elevating it to a national pastime. Others argued that the rise of the middle class in the 19th century played a major role in spreading the tradition, allowing the ritual of afternoon tea to become more accessible, moving beyond just aristocratic circles. Either way, tea served with such precision and care became a symbol of refinement and class one that, as we'll see, would soon be democratized and woven into the fabric of British culture. But while tea and food were undoubtedly at the heart of these gatherings, they weren't the only elements that defined a successful tea party. There were other subtle but significant factors at play. For example, the presentation of the table was key. After all, a well-set table spoke volumes about your wealth and your ability to host. Fine china, polished silver, and crystal glasses were all carefully arranged to create a scene of understated opulence. The way the food was arranged on the table was just as important as the food itself. Tiered cake stands, often stacked with scones, biscuits, and tarts, created a sense of grandeur, while delicate teacups were arranged in perfect symmetry. Yet, the food wasn't just about luxury, it was also about symbolism. For instance, cucumber sandwiches, which were often served as an appetizer or starter, were a symbol of refinement. Cucumber was seen as an exquisite, delicate ingredient, making it the perfect choice for a high society. Similarly, scones were regarded as quintessentially British, a reflection of national pride and tradition. The presence of tea cakes and chocolates on the table also served to remind everyone that the Victorian tea party was more than just a meal, both individual and collective. As we wrap up our discussion of the menu, it is clear that the culinary aspect of the Victorian tea party was a perfect reflection of its broader cultural significance. Tea, along with the carefully curated foods, wasn't just sustenance, it was a performance, a delicate dance of social expectations and personal pride. But what happens when the tea party begins to evolve, as it inevitably did, into a more public affair? In the next section, we'll explore the transition from private aristocratic gatherings to more accessible, middle-class tea events, and how the essence of tea parties began to change during the later years of the Victorian era. As we continue our journey through the world of Victorian tea parties, we now find ourselves at a turning point. The grandeur and exclusivity of tea parties were not to last forever. As the Victorian era unfolded, society began to shift, and with it, the nature of these gatherings changed as well. The rise of the middle class, fueled by the Industrial Revolution, led to a profound transformation in the way tea was consumed and who was allowed to partake in these rituals of social importance. For the upper echelons of Victorian society, tea parties had always been a way to define and display their social superiority. However, by the late 19th century, as more people found themselves enjoying newfound wealth and status, the previously exclusive world of afternoon tea began to open up. Suddenly, the teapot was no longer a symbol of the aristocracy. Middle-class families, who had once watched from the sidelines, now felt empowered to host their own gatherings, adopting the tea party ritual as part of their own social fabric. But this new middle-class tea party came with its own set of modifications. One of the first shifts we see is in the formality of the occasion. For the aristocracy, tea parties were about more than just tea and conversation. There were elaborate displays of wealth, social structure, and taste. But for the middle class, the gatherings became more casual, focused less on strict adherence to rules and more on simple social interaction. It was still an event, yes, but it became more accessible, and in some ways, less rigid. There were still carefully selected sweets and savories, but now, the conversation wasn't solely about politics and philosophy. It was about families, business, and the day-to-day lives of the people attending. Interestingly, the way tea was served also shifted. Tea was still at the center, of course, but now there was less emphasis on the formal presentation of the teacups, and more on the comfort of the gathering. The middle class, particularly in cities like London, started hosting larger, more inclusive tea parties, where guests could simply gather around a table, drink their tea, and enjoy one another's company without the heavy weight of tradition hanging over them. Teacups still mattered, but glasses and mugs started to creep in, replacing the fine-bone china that was once reserved for the elite. For those who had grown accustomed to the finer things, this shift might have been seen as a loss of refinement, but for the growing middle class, it represented a shift towards inclusivity where the art of tea drinking was open to all. Historians still argue whether the rise of the middle class in the Victorian era was the end of the exclusivity of tea parties, or simply an evolution of the practice. Some believe that as more people began hosting tea parties, the event itself became diluted, losing much of the ceremony and social weight it once held. Others argue that the middle class breathed new life into the tradition, democratizing it and making it a part of everyday social life. What is clear, however, is that by the end of the Victorian era, tea parties had become a staple for people from all walks of life. Not just the aristocrats who had once defined them, but it wasn't just the guests and the style that changed. Tea itself became more widely available, more affordable, and more diverse. No longer reserved for the elite, tea was now a drink that everyone could enjoy, regardless of their social standing. The variety of tea blends expanded beyond the simple black tea favored by the aristocracy. You could now find green tea, oolong tea, and a variety of herbal infusions available on the shelves. For those who had grown up drinking tea exclusively at posh gatherings, it was a game-changer. Tea became accessible not just at the high society tea parties, but in every home. Now, let us take a look at how this shift from exclusivity to accessibility influenced the experience of the tea party itself. What had once been an intimate, formal event for the privileged few became a relaxed social occasion for families and friends. But even with these changes, one thing remained constant. The tea party was still a moment to slow down, to pause and engage with others in a way that was distinctly Victorian, albeit now with a broader reach. As we continue to witness the evolution of the Victorian Tea Party, it's important to acknowledge the peculiar traditions that flourished during this time. Though the structure of the gatherings began to shift, certain rituals and customs persisted, often in curious and unexpected ways. For example, many Victorian tea parties included games and activities that might seem out of place today but were considered essential to the charm and entertainment of the event. One such tradition was tea leaf reading, a practice that quickly became a staple at many tea parties. Guests would sip their tea and, once they had finished, would examine the remaining tea leaves at the bottom of their cup. By interpreting the patterns left behind, they believed they could predict the future, read their fortune, or uncover hidden truths about their lives. This practice, known as tasseography, was part of the Victorian fascination with spiritualism and the supernatural. While it might seem odd today, it was a widely accepted part of many upper-class tea gatherings, where guests would gather around and share their tea readings, often in a playful, light-hearted way. Historians still debate whether this fascination with fortune-telling was a reflection of Victorian anxieties over the rapidly changing world, or if it was simply a quirky, albeit harmless pastime that added a bit of fun to the often rigidly structured tea parties. Some argue that spiritualism and other forms of mysticism grew in popularity during the Victorian era as a response to the uncertainties of modern life, particularly as the Industrial Revolution and the rise of science began to challenge traditional beliefs. Others suggest that tea leaf reading was simply another form of entertainment that allowed the aristocracy to pass the time in a way that was both relaxing and socially engaging. In addition to tasseography, some tea parties featured silent auctions, another example of the quirky traditions that were often associated with these gatherings. Guests would often place small bids on objects, such as fine china, ornate silverware, or even exclusive tea blends. While the auctions were mostly for fun, they were also a way for the host to show off their wealth and to create an atmosphere of exclusivity and competition. The bidding wars that sometimes occurred at these tea parties were as much about social standing as they were about the actual items being auctioned. In many ways, they were a playful way to display one's wealth and taste, while also engaging in light-hearted competition with others. One of the oldest traditions involved the use of feathered fans. These delicate fans were not just for cooling oneself. They were used in a subtle, yet significant way, to signal social cues. Women would use fans to express a range of emotions or intentions, all without speaking a word. The way you held your fan, whether open or closed, could communicate everything from interest in a conversation to displeasure with the proceedings. This was just another example of the complex codes that governed the behavior at Victorian tea parties, where nothing was left to chance. While these quirky activities and rituals may seem strange to us now, They played a significant role in maintaining the atmosphere of refinement and exclusivity at tea parties. These little details, whether it was reading tea leaves, bidding on a rare item, or communicating with a fan, were all part of the performance of high society. The tea party wasn't just a social gathering, it was a carefully crafted show where everyone knew their place, their role, and what was expected of them. But what about those who didn't fit the mold? What happened when someone broke the rules? How did reputation come into play at a Victorian tea party? Let's explore this further in the next section. By now, we've explored how fashion, conversation, and even quirky traditions shaped the world of the Victorian tea party. But one thing that stands above all else is the importance of reputation. Victorian society was built on a delicate web of social expectations, and nowhere was this more visible than at a tea party. This wasn't just an event to socialize, it was a moment to affirm your place in the social order. And while tea parties offered a space for relaxation and connection, they also demanded careful navigation to ensure that no one stepped out of line. For the hostess, the stakes were particularly high. Hosting a tea party was a way to demonstrate hospitality, refinement, and most importantly, control. The way she managed the gathering, the guest list, the conversation, the pacing was a direct reflection of her social prowess. If she handled things well, she could reinforce her position in society, cementing her place in high society's network. But a misstep could lead to social disgrace. A poorly managed tea party could reflect badly on her, signaling to others that she was incompetent, unrefined, or perhaps even unworthy of the company of other aristocrats. Hosting a tea party was as much about performing as it was about providing a comfortable space for her guests. But it wasn't just the hostess who had to mind their reputation. Every guest had to be keenly aware of their place in the social structure. Each action, each word, could either elevate or diminish their standing. For instance, if you arrived late, it was seen as a sign of poor manners, suggesting that you were either disorganized or didn't value the host's invitation. If you overindulged in the food or drink, you risked looking greedy or lacking in. Similarly, if you took too long to finish your tea, it could give the impression that you were either overindulgent or that you were avoiding conversation. In Victorian society, every small detail was scrutinized, and those who didn't meet the standard of refinement could quickly find themselves out of favor. The rules of conversation were just as strict, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. A well-timed joke or sharp wit could win you admiration, while an awkward silence or a misplaced comment could make you the object of mockery or even exclusion. It wasn't just about having good manners. It was about playing the game and understanding the unwritten codes that governed Victorian social life. A guest who knew how to navigate these codes could leave the party with their reputation intact, while those who didn't risked being talked about for years to come. In fact, gossip was a powerful weapon at tea parties, and it was often used to either raise or ruin someone's reputation. And let's not forget the servants, who were also bound by these invisible social rules. The role of a servant at a tea party was to remain invisible, quietly serving tea and refilling cups without drawing attention to themselves. They had to be attentive and efficient, but never overly so. In a way, they were like the silent observers of the entire event, privy to the whispered gossip and knowing looks that were exchanged around the table. Servants could ruin a host's reputation if they were caught eavesdropping or talking out of turn. On the flip side, they could be elevated in society if they performed their duties with grace and discretion. The entire event, in fact, was a performance of social norms, and everyone from the highest guest to the lowest servant. Historians still argue whether these rigid social structures helped to create a more cohesive society or whether they merely reinforced elitism and inequality. Some believe that these highly structured tea parties were a form of control, designed to maintain the status quo by keeping people in their designated roles. Others argue that these gatherings gave people a sense of belonging, creating a space where people could form alliances, share ideas, and feel part of something larger. What's clear, though, is that the Victorian tea party was as much about the unspoken rules of behavior as it was about the spoken conversations. As the century progressed, however, this system began to shift. The rising middle class, the changing political landscape, and even new technologies slowly began to dismantle the old guard. Tea parties, while still seen as the epitome of class and refinement, started to lose their exclusivity. No longer were they only for the aristocracies, and the entire nation would be able to enjoy the calming ritual of afternoon tea. But in the next section, we'll take a closer look at the decline of the Victorian tea party, and how it began to evolve into something more inclusive yet still deeply tied to its roots in high society. As we near the end of our exploration into the world of Victorian tea parties, it is time to examine a key turning point in their evolution: the decline of the extravagant exclusive tea gatherings and the rise of more inclusive tea events. As we've seen, tea parties were once reserved for the aristocracy, with strict codes governing the behavior of both host and guest. But as the Victorian era progressed, society began to change in ways that would make tea parties accessible to a much broader audience. The most significant change came with the Industrial Revolution, which brought about a profound transformation in the economic landscape of Britain. The rise of the middle class meant that more people had the means and the desire to adopt the rituals of the upper classes. Tea parties, once seen as a symbol of wealth and social superiority, gradually began to take on a new form. They became less about the elaborate performance and more about social interaction and community bonding. The once exquisite gatherings, full of grandeur and decorum, started to feel somewhat out of touch with the changing social realities of the time. The industrial boom had led to increased wealth for the middle class, who were eager to emulate the aristocracy and take part in what was seen as a symbol of refinement: afternoon tea. However, for these families, the tea party didn't need to be as elaborate. Instead of polished silverware and bone china, the middle class was content with simple porcelain cups and basic sandwiches. Tea leaf reading and silent auctions became a thing of the past, as the more formal elements of the gathering faded away. Tea was now enjoyed in a casual setting, where conversation could flow freely and guests didn't have to worry about keeping their manners in check at every turn. This change was further propelled by social reforms, which began to challenge the rigid class structure that had once dictated who could attend a tea party. The extension of voting rights, the rise of workers' unions, and the gradual collapse of aristocratic privilege meant that tea parties could no longer maintain the same air of exclusivity. As the middle class found itself with more political and economic power, the very definition of a proper tea party began to evolve. In fact, many historians argue that the decline of the Victorian tea party in its original form was part of a larger societal shift toward the idea of the everyman sitting down to tea became more commonplace, as tea became widely available to the masses, thanks to increased production and importation of tea. Lower prices, coupled with improved transportation systems, made tea accessible to everyone, not just the rich. This democratization of tea was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it made the ritual of tea drinking accessible to a wider audience. On the other hand, it diluted the exclusive charm that the Victorian elite had once enjoyed. Despite these changes, tea parties didn't disappear entirely. Rather, they evolved into something more relaxed and inclusive, still retaining an air of gentility, but no longer bound by the rules and rituals of the past. Tea parties became more about the experience than the presentation. The focus shifted from appearance and status to enjoying tea as a social activity. Families and friends gathered, often in their homes, without the fear of social missteps or strict expectations. This was a departure from the days when anything less than perfection at a tea party could result in ostracism. By the early 20th century, the Victorian tea party had shed its rigid structure and become a more relaxed social gathering. It was still an important occasion, but its exclusivity had faded. The middle class, who had once aspired to imitate the aristocracy, now found themselves redefining the tea party as their own. And yet, in many ways, the core of the tradition remained unchanged. The gathering still centered around tea and conversation, still offered a moment of respite from the chaos of daily life, and still held a space for social connection. In our next section, we'll look at how these changes played out in modern society. Despite its evolution, the Victorian Tea Party's influence can still be seen today in the afternoon tea tradition that persists in many cultures. What began as an exclusive aristocratic ritual became a globally embraced symbol of comfort and cultural heritage, one that still holds a place in the hearts of tea lovers around the world. As we arrive at the final chapter of our journey through the secret world of Victorian tea parties, let us take a moment to reflect on how these gatherings have evolved over time and what they mean in modern culture. The once exclusive and elite Victorian tea parties, with their formal seating arrangements and strict rules of conversation, have transformed into an event that is now enjoyed by people across the world. Though many of the rituals and social barriers that defined the original gatherings have faded, the core of what made these tea parties so special remains intact. In today's world, the tea party may no longer be a high-stakes social game for the aristocracy, but it still carries a certain nostalgic charm. Afternoon tea, as we know it today, has become more casual and accessible, but it's no less meaningful. People still gather to share tea, conversation, and small treats, albeit without the heavy expectations of Victorian society. There are fancy tea rooms offering the same delicate scones, finger sandwiches, and clotted cream, and some people still host their own tea parties at home, continuing the tradition in a relaxed, informal way. Even though tea has become democratized and the rigid rules of Victorian tea parties are no longer as relevant, the rituals of tea drinking remain powerful. Just like in the past, tea is still a symbol of comfort, relaxation, and connection. It is a way to pause in the middle of the day and share a moment with friends, family, or colleagues, even if the world around us is fast-paced and chaotic. There's something almost timeless about the tradition of sitting down with a cup of tea, slowing down, and taking a breath. Of course, there's still an element of nostalgia that surrounds the idea of the Victorian Tea Party, particularly for those who seek to embrace the finer things in life. Some people still look to the past, yearning for the elegance and sophistication of the Victorian era, and for them, the idea of hosting a grand, formal tea party complete with fine china, lace tablecloths, and an intricate spread of delicacies still holds appeal. There's an undeniable charm in the idea of recreating those lost traditions, of stepping into a world where every detail matters, where conversation is carefully crafted, and where tea is a ceremony as much as it is a drink. But in a modern world where inclusivity and informality are often celebrated, the essence of the Victorian Tea Party has transformed into something that feels both traditional and fresh. It's no longer confined to the upper classes, nor is it bound by the rigorous codes of behavior that once made it a high-stakes event. It's become a symbol of connection, of pausing for a moment of calm amidst the busy rhythms of life. As you reflect on all of this, consider the role that tea plays in your own life. Whether you drink it as a moment of personal solace, or whether you enjoy it as part of a gathering with loved ones, tea still has a unique way of bringing us together. The Victorian Tea Party, in all its elaborate glory, has long since faded into the past, but the spirit of tea, the quiet ritual of gathering, sipping, and sharing remains as relevant today as it was in the 19th century. And with that, we bring our journey through the secret world of Victorian tea parties to a close. As we wrap up this exploration, let's slow the pace down just a little more, take a final sip of our metaphorical tea, and appreciate the legacy of these gatherings that have woven their way into the fabric of our social lives. The grand rituals, the delicate fashion, the subtle conversations, though they may have evolved, their essence lives on. So take a deep breath, unwind, and let the echoes of the Victorian Tea Party fade gently into the past.